Thank you very much. Thanks to Desmond and Liza and Haywood for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to do it again. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. So I was delighted when I was asked to give a keynote at this conference almost exactly a year ago. The themes of it spoke to a lot of work that I had been doing on 18th century women and their intellectual lives, particularly those whose writing crosses established critical boundaries between amateur and professional work and between manuscript and print. I have been interested not only in the kinds of thinking and texts that these women produced, but what the very concept of productivity might have looked like for them. What was the process by which intellectual labor fit into their daily lives as women in this period? What sorts of habits did they try to form to sustain it? And how did their own sense of having accomplished something complement or contrast with our current ideas of being productive in the age of the research excellence framework? So all of those were the sorts of things that I was pondering at the time when I was first considering this paper. And then, of course, the pandemic struck, and questions of productivity suddenly became a lot more urgent for all of us. Much like an 18th century gentlewoman, many of us suddenly both had and did not have acres of unstructured time, and we were reevaluating how to use it while often struggling with feelings of pressure, guilt, and loss of control. We also turned to working from home with links to 18th century conceptions of domesticity and private versus public life. And I remember there was a sudden surge of advice in how to do so most effectively, stressing over and over the importance of maintaining a routine. If we could only get into the habit of waking up at the same time every morning, putting on some proper clothes, taking an invigorating walk before sitting down at our desks, then this sheer repetition would enable us to reassert a level of control over our lives and make the most of this strange interval. The hope was that we would then come out of lockdown with some concrete outputs to show for it, both personally and professionally, whether that was writing King Lear, learning a new language, or finally mastering sourdough. Of course, the situations are not exactly equivalent. The 18th century Bluestockings were not actually confined to their houses. And while they lived to their share of historical events and anxieties, there was not the same sense of drastically adjusting in response to a crisis. Yet the past year has made particularly acute the question of what productivity means, and especially what productivity means for women. We know now that women's working lives have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic, that female academics have been publishing far less, and that the existing precarity and inequalities within our sector have been sharply exacerbated. There are many reasons for that, particularly childcare, that lie outside the scope of my paper today. But it did highlight for me the way that critical evaluations of 18th century intellectual women's working lives have often taken place against a sort of imagined ideal of productivity. And here's one example of that from Sylvia Myers's book on the Bluestockings that betrays that kind of thinking. Myers writes that in a tentative way, they were approaching professional authorship, a pursuit which includes a concern with making a living by writing, if possible, and a long-term commitment to productive work. But they could not and did not reach that stage because of their own internal constraints and the lack of support of their society. So I think there are some unexamined assumptions here, particularly that productive work must lead to financial compensation, or at least the potential for it. And further, that it must proceed in a consistent and linear way. Of Elizabeth Carter, for example, Myers writes that her career was spasmodic and unproductive. She did not build the sort of consistent confidence and determination which would have been necessary to overcome her natural female diffidence. It is possible, Myers even suggests, that marriage to another scholar might have helped her to pursue work in a more systematic way. As I will discuss, however, the long-term commitment to productive work was in fact very much a feature of these women's lives. They tried to build specific habits in order to sustain it. And it just wasn't always in keeping with our own ideas of productivity, or always successful and uninterrupted. But part of what I want to argue is that we cannot try to hold these women to standards of success that may actually remain impossible to achieve today. The career of the pioneering medieval scholar Elizabeth Elstob provides a useful illustration. In the early 1700s, Elstob worked alongside her brother and other Oxford Anglo-Saxonists in beginning to edit and translate Old English texts. Her connections allowed her to receive substantial institutional support and library access, and to undertake lengthy and highly ambitious projects. These included the first Old English to modern English grammar, which she hoped would be particularly useful to other women studying the language. Following the deaths of her brother and their main supporter, however, Elstob ran into financial difficulties. She had to abandon her work, sell her books, and try to make a living by teaching small children in a provincial school. Some years later, in the 1730s, she was rediscovered by her fellow antiquarians, with whom she entered into correspondence. Eventually, they helped her to get a post as governess to the children of the Duchess of Portland, where she lived out the remainder of her life. Being of a lower social rank than most of the later Bluestockings, including the Duchess of Portland herself, Elstob demonstrates the difficulty of combining scholarship with a daily paying job. Invited to do some Anglo-Saxon work by her friend, the antiquarian George Ballard, she lamented the unhappy circumstances I have labored under for several years, which deprived me of leisure to follow those studies, which were my only delight and employment when I had nothing else to do. Now she fears that her language skills have grown rusty through this long interruption. Even more significantly, she describes how she has no time to do anything till 6 at night when I have done the duty of the day, and am then frequently so fatigued that I'm obliged to lie down for an hour or two to rest. At another point, she notes, I have but little time to think or do anything else. She does seem to have enjoyed her teaching work and taken pride in it, writing that it is a way of life I must confess I am fond of, if it were not precarious and fatiguing, but with that I am content. Yet the latter half of her career has remained a critical disappointment, often being framed as a tragedy of her being rescued too late. In her own brief third-person autobiography, Elstob describes her scholarship as being cut short by ill fortune. She had several other designs, but was unhappily hindered by a necessity of getting her bread. At the conclusion of an article on Elstob in the late 1990s, Mathilde Gretsch writes, if Elizabeth Elstob had lived in our days, she would perhaps have found a post in an English department, which would have provided her with some moderate financial base to pursue her scholarly inclinations. I think this is a tempting fantasy, much like the myth of Shakespeare's sister that we get from Virginia Woolf. If only these talented women had been alive in this more enlightened age, like us, just think what they might have accomplished. Gretsch ends up admitting, however, that it's just as likely that Elstob's career would have been cut short through the demands of university publishing and lack of funding in early medieval literature, which has only become more acute over the past 20 years. Certainly, Elstob's description of fatigue and lack of time to think are ones that many of us will find extremely familiar. In the preface to one of her publications, Elstob had famously begun by asking, what has a woman to do with learning? One answer I would suggest is that learning is something that one has to do. 18th century collected biographies of learned women, like George Ballard's, ultimately focused on their learnedness as an attribute to be celebrated, like virtue or beauty. It was no accident that still living women were usually not included. But by focusing on intellectual work as a process that necessarily happens through time, we can gain a better picture of how these women pursued it and the obstacles that they might have faced. These were not always so stark as Elstob's lack of money or any direct disapproval from men. Most of the women who would come to be associated with the Bluestockings were of comfortable and sometimes aristocratic means. They benefited from a wide-ranging education and encouragement, a household of servants, access to extensive private and lending libraries. And I would argue that, in fact, they were productive. They read and wrote extensively in both manuscript and print. They acquired knowledge in many different fields and applied it. To various degrees, they ran households and business concerns, were involved in patronage and politics, cultivated networks, and raised families. The sheer amount of archival material that remains for researchers like myself to sift through testifies to the significant trace that their intellectual activity left behind. And yet, if there is a sense of unfulfilled potential, then it was one that they themselves often shared, fearing that they were not making the very best of their time and opportunities. We can see this in the late 17th century manuscript writings of Mary Evelyn, the eldest daughter of the diarist John Evelyn. Her religious meditations include a book of rules for spending my precious time well. These build on instructions drawn up by her father and lessons she gathered from the Bible, but show her synthesizing these external prompts into her own understanding of a good life. Going to bed seasonably and early rising are a main concern of Evelyn's, as they will prove to be for women throughout my paper. She reasons herself into it through relevant biblical passages as well as lived experience, since lying late in bed causes laziness, stupidity, and dullness of the senses. She therefore resolves, through God's assistance, never to rise later than 7 o'clock for the future. It is the groundwork of many duties, which will at last bring me to everlasting rest. But company, civility to them, and their persuasions makes me never mistress of myself. Often books and 100 other things employ me then. Therefore, I ought to make this resolution very binding, that so I may be obliged to keep it strictly. Evelyn acknowledges both the justifications for keeping early hours and the obstacles towards achieving this. In her own sinful inclinations towards plays and romances, as well as the social demands that make her never mistress of herself. The preciousness of Mary Evelyn's time gained added poignancy from her early death of smallpox 2 years later at the age of 19, leaving her father to index these fragmentary collections of her writings. When looking through her possessions after her death, her parents were amazed to find such an incredible number of papers and collections she had made. So many indeed, as it is plainly astonishing how one that had acquired such substantial and practical knowledge, as well as paying and receiving visits, necessary conversation, and other unavoidable impertinences of life, would find much more employ her time to accomplish a quarter of what she has left. But John Evelyn concludes, as she was a little miracle whilst she lived, so she died without example. Mary Evelyn's short life therefore becomes defined by a miraculous level of textual productivity, carried out alongside the unavoidable impertinences of life, so well as to be nearly invisible before her death. It is unfortunate that only a few of her books now survive, although ranging from sermon notes to a fragment of a romance, they still testify to the breadth of her interest. Although she was little known at the time, Evelyn's writing and legacy also bear an uncanny resemblance to those of a later, though fictional, young woman, who was also intended as an unparalleled example and would leave the world at about the same age, the protagonist of Samuel Richardson's novel, Clarissa Harlowe. The length and detail of Clarissa's letters show her own near miraculous production of writing. At times, this can total more than 10,000 words a day, which, even given how circumscribed her other activities become, is still a very impressive achievement. We are told that she gets up early in the mornings and that she is unusually dedicated to recording her experiences. But it is only after Clarissa's death that we are first given a detailed account of how she had habitually fit her writing into her day, in her friend Anna Howe's eulogizing character of her. Of course, this is partly Richardson answering his own critics by trying to explain away Clarissa's extreme level of youth and accomplishment. According to Anna, she used to say it was incredible to think what might be done by early rising and by long days well filled up. She also used to say that no one could spend their time properly who did not live by some rule and appropriate the hours to particular purposes and employments. So under a series of headings, we have Clarissa's own daily appropriation. She allows only 6 hours for sleep, or even less, given that her 3 morning hours of study and closet duties are occasionally augmented by those she saved from rest. It is in this time that she pursues her epistolary amusements, because it is seen as extra. It doesn't impinge on her other duties, and it is not fungible with anything except for her sleep. Because even Clarissa's distribution, for all of its apparent strict method and control, still requires some flexibility. She often has to borrow time from one task to another, particularly when social obligations require it. The tidiness of the schedule begins to fracture as soon as we move from the headings into the detail. The hours are packaged into weekly lots, redistributed, varied as she visits friends or relatives. Because of course, she must never give any outward sign that she keeps any such schedule, and must always remain cheerful and unhurried in company. For Clarissa, time is literally money. She thinks of it in terms of credits and debts, and of the 4 evening hours as her fund upon which she draws to satisfy her other debits. In her special account book, she makes a weekly reckoning with herself, stewarding her time in the same way that she stewards her household expenses. Although never allowed to take possession of her independent fortune, or even to wish for it, Clarissa remains, as she puts it, covetous of time, the only thing of which we can be allowably covetous. In monetary terms, then, we could say that Clarissa is spending time, but she is also producing it. She creates letters, but only after she has created the time in which to do so. It is this that enables her, as in Anna's words, to have actually lived more years at 16 than other women had at 26. Both the schedule itself and the keeping of the account book are also repeatedly described as pleasant to her. By going above and beyond in her supererogatories, Clarissa finds a form of pleasurable excess that paradoxically comes from self-discipline. If timekeeping is a way of being allowably covetous, then it is also a way of being allowably proud. She always gloried, we're told, in accustoming herself to behold the sunrise. This must be both because sunrises are attractive in themselves and because one must accustom oneself to regularly seeing them in a way that most women of her class cannot manage to do. Dressing, which is the other meaning of habit, is another feminine occupation that Clarissa has strict ideas about. There's a tightrope to be walked here because caring about dress too much is a vain and frivolous waste of time, but caring too little leads to the slovenliness that becomes associated with both the overly learned woman and the late rising lady of fashion. We can infer that Clarissa spends her earliest writing hours in a state of loose undress, since she won't make a servant get up so early to help her. However, she insists on always being fully dressed for the day, immediately after breakfast, something that many women delayed until the afternoon. As she writes to Anna while confined at Harlowe Place, this custom, although a prisoner, and neither visited nor visiting, I continue, one owes to oneself and to one's sex, you know, to be always neat, and never to be surprised in a way one should be pained to be seen in. Besides, people in adversity, which is the state of trial of every good quality, should endeavor to preserve laudable customs, that if sunshine return, they may not be losers by their trial. It's hard not to see here, I think, an echo of how for the past year, we have constantly been told to change out of our pajamas because we owe it to ourselves, even if we are neither visited nor visiting. You never know, after all, when you might need to be presentable for Zoom. Clarissa lives in a similar state of always seeing herself and preparing to be seen, poised to demonstrate her ability to turn even adversity to account. Clarissa, of course, is presented as a paragon that would be impossible to fully live up to, not only in how much she manages to accomplish, but the apparent ease and fluency with which it's done. Lovelace, and by extension, Richardson himself, has to subject her to an unbearable series of trials before he can even begin to make a dent in her regular way of life. But turning back to the letters and diaries of real women, we can see how this effort was made under practical conditions. And my particular focus here will be on Catherine Talbot, who came to be a friend and collaborator of Richardson's, and was strongly influenced by Clarissa's methods of managing her time. Even before the publication of the novel, however, Talbot had already begun to share this preoccupation. She kept journals at various points in her life for different purposes and in different levels of detail, not all of which have survived. Some of them were private and some were meant to be shared, but all show a concern with recording and evaluating both Talbot's daily activities and her shifting emotional state. In the early 1750s, she addressed one journal to her new young friend, Julia Barclay, whom she had adopted as a protege, serving as a model for how Julia should be doing the same. Clearly inspired by Clarissa's account book, Talbot instructs her in how to get into a right method of journaling. Upon reading Julia's first attempt, for example, she notes that in Tuesday, you will see, there are 3 hours unaccounted for. Such hours are essentially lost twice over, once in whatever idle loitering they might have contained, and again by remaining unrecorded. This mutual exchange of accounts is intended to keep both Talbot and Julia accountable and further their attempts to optimize their time. This day has been the more pleasing to me, Talbot writes at one point, because I have not, I think, lost 5 minutes of it. And to that end, she shares a number of what we might call her productivity hacks. For example, she particularly tries to cut down on time spent in dressing. While being neatly dressed for the day is important, as we've established, the process itself can stretch into endless foolish formality, which either wastes your own time or makes other people wait for you. Talbot seeks to shave it down to 15 minutes a day, but this can lead to sloppiness. I do not care, she insists, and yet I will mend, for to be less a dowdy would require not a minute more time, only a little more care, and one should do nothing ill, be it never such a trifle. Her entire life sometimes feels like it is spent on nothing but trifles. So if she doesn't perform those well, then what else is there? She also engages in other forms of prioritization and multitasking. All reading, for example, is not equal, since Talbot divides it up into serious and silly books. At one point, she writes, "I have been too idle today, as I might have employed myself much better than in reading a French book." There are also times when reading becomes a distraction from other, more urgent activities. Then what does Miss do but take up an idle Italian comedy and read in it for an hour, though she had a letter to write to Lady Grey and half of her things to pack up before supper. How vexed was she at herself afterwards, and what good resolutions did she make from henceforth to postpone all unnecessaries till necessaries are dispatched? Eventually, finding that stricter measures are called for, I locked up all my books, that I might have no temptation to neglect writing some necessary letters. We could see the distinction between necessaries and unnecessaries here as one between the consumption of reading and the productivity of writing. But what makes the letters truly necessary is that they are an effective debt that Talbot owes to other people, often on a regular weekly schedule, to particular correspondence, with deadlines of postal collection that further structure her time. Those of us who work on 18th century correspondence become very familiar with the groveling apology for not writing sooner, or for allowing letters to pile up unanswered. Like any trope, these apologies are sometimes formulaic or lighthearted, and sometimes genuinely anxious. The paradox is that these letters are both a vital emotional connection and an outlet for producing volumes of witty and informative correspondence. And at the same time, they are yet another task that causes these writers to labor under a constant sense of belatedness and insufficiency. So books can be a distraction from letters, especially when they are silly books. Although Talbot writes that even trifling books are a necessary medicine sometimes, and they can give rise to worthy and serious reflections. Letters can be a distraction from the better purposes of Sunday prayers. But what if those letters are such as mend her heart and heighten her gratitude to God for the friendship that they communicate? This letter writing is then interrupted by a visit from her friend, the Duchess of Somerset's two little boys, who demand that she read from scripture to them. And what employment could be more agreeable? No wonder if, in practice, all of Talbot's good resolutions have a tendency to fall apart under these competing demands. One potential answer to that is multitasking. Talbot cautions Julia from attempting too many things at once, of flying from book to book and from scheme to scheme. But many of her typical activities are such that as do allow of harmonious combination. Once again, Clarissa provides the model here, since one way that she is able to combine her rigorous schedule while giving enough time to family and neighbors is that she does her needlework while talking or listening to a book being read. We see many examples in Catherine Talbot's journals. She admires her friend Elizabeth Anson, for example, for being someone that one could go and do needlework with, while she dispatched 100 affairs for herself and other people with such liveliness, such prudence, such ease and good nature, as made me love her more than ever. Reading is another activity that can be combined with others. In sources from the period, we see women reading while having their hair done, reading while eating, as long as it's not accompanying, reading while traveling in carriages, and reading while walking. The last of these was particularly a concern for Talbot. Beginning to suffer from chronic pain and poor health from her 30s, she was sometimes urged to rest, which made her feel idle, and sometimes to move around as much as possible, which took up time. One wet November day, she records spending a quarter of an hour running up and down all the staircases I could find by way of exercise, and then another 3/4 walking while reading Psalms, looking out the windows and musing on some of my own faults. On another day, she says, I read, writ, tried to ply myself, but was heavy and dull and could do nothing to purpose. So to cheat little miss into doing herself good, I put the new play Boadicea into her hand and charged her to walk up and down stairs and round all the rooms till she had read it through. My legs held out for 3 acts, and I was the better all day for the exercise. Jokingly referring to herself in the third person as Little Miss, despite her actual age, indicates the infantilizing quality of self-discipline. In the same way that she's sending these journals to give advice to a teenage protege, Talbot here externalizes her own self as a reluctant student that she must cajole and even trick into doing what she's supposed to do. That is the nature of productivity hacks, after all. We are not really hacking productivity, but hacking ourselves and our relationship to it. Of course, Talbot is not exactly concerned with productivity as such, in the commercial sense that we now associate with it. What she is concerned about is ideas of use and improvement, which means not only making the world better in some way, but also the constant improving and perfection of oneself. In one of her poems, which is once again on the subject of early rising, She urges a friend towards this as a kind of low-key heroism. "O rouse thee then, nor shun the glorious strife. Extend, improve, enjoy thy hours of life. Search thy reason, animate thy heart, and act through life's short scene, the useful part." We can see how Talbot defines such action by how she describes failing to achieve it. As when she writes to Elizabeth Carter, "I read little, write less, and think least of all to any purpose. Working and flower painting come in only by the by. Riding and walking take up many hours, but they are absolutely necessary to my health." So improvement includes not only reading and writing, but thinking, especially on serious and religious topics. It also includes learning things, even in adulthood, with no immediate purpose, such as studying Italian or arithmetic, or practicing music or drawing. By studying such apparently amateur activities, often pursued with remarkable dedication and accomplishment, I hope to move beyond narratives of professionalization in women's cultural contributions in this period. However, it's worth noting that their sense of purpose thus encompasses both activities that we would consider to be work and those that we would consider to be leisure. The very lack of boundaries between the two could potentially be creative and enabling. But as Christina Lupton has recently argued, it may also have contributed to Talbot's strong sense of anxiety about her use of time. Talbot's writings have often been seen as a form of obsessive religious self-monitoring, born of feminine repression and self-consciousness from living with a strict guardian and feeling that her time was never fully her own. Even Elizabeth Carter warned her about being so scrupulously cautious, may I not venture to say, in some instances, so superstitiously cautious, not to misemploy the least moment. Certainly, it seems to me that Talbot must have suffered from what we would now call depression. In her diary, she describes extremes of emotion that are not always prompted by any external events. Sometimes, even after an apparently well-spent, enjoyable day, she just feels overwhelmingly sad and discontented with herself. Along with increasing poor health, which would culminate in her death of cancer at the age of 49, this led to headaches, difficulty sleeping, and irritation with people's demands. Mental and physical illness thus create a cycle in which she feels dull, heavy, and tired, and therefore worthless and miserable, and vice versa. And while it can be hard to describe cause and effect in such cases, we could view Talbot's timekeeping less as a symptom of self-hatred and more as a strategy of coping with it. It is only by setting herself tasks and forming a regular plan of employment that she can keep in conceit with herself. This strategy was apparently something that she first formed when she was in her early 20s. Her friend's daughter, Amabel Gray, would record in her own diary how Talbot told her about getting over an unsuccessful love affair in the early 1740s. She imposed some task upon herself for every hour of the day, which she diligently went through, till by bedtime she was wearied and sleepy. Thus she studied a little Greek, read out receipts, read essays, read history, and totally forbid herself reading romances or poetry. Talbot's advice to Julia Barclay whenever Julia complains of want of health or spirits is very much along the same lines. She instructs her to use constant exercise and go on diligently and regularly in your employments and your journal. And she quotes a French religious writer in counseling that you should try to live one moment at a time, to forget whatever precedes and succeeds it, and abandon yourself to divine providence, which sounds very much like an 18th century Christian version of mindfulness. But my love, when you're really heavy and dull and cannot get the better of it, if the sun shines out, run it into your pretty garden for 10 minutes, or else play a tune on your harpsichord, or take up, but for a quarter hour at the very most, some agreeable yet not unuseful idle book, which I think is very good advice if you happen to have a garden or a harpsichord at hand. The benefits of fresh air and a change being as good as a rest also figure on a broader level within their writings. Habits and timekeeping are often conceived in terms of the space that one inhabits and how one organizes and moves through it. When she was changing her London residence from St. Paul's to Lambeth, for example, Talbot tells Carter that the great advantage of going to a new place is to break off old habits that were faulty and setting everything, one's time and all, in such exact order that proper time and place may be allotted for each. She then imagines her time as being like a large room, which by the interruptions of a London life was all cut into closets and passages, and those were all filled with rubbish too. This room must be supported upon pretty arches and pillars of useful and necessary employments, serious studies, and domestic attentions, else the weight of it would crush one very soon. She pictures it as being hung up with portraits of her friends, scented with citrons, evergreens, and roses, and filled with ingenious ornaments and secretaires full of amusing books. Although a bit more highly ornamented, this description also greatly resembled the hermitage that Talbot imagines in the first of her published dialogues, which contains a cave with two plain rooms, a telescope, shelves of books, a bed of plain white dimity opposite to the chimney, where a cheerful wood fire is continually blazing. Near the fire is placed a little table and a low seat, and the walls are covered with a white paper, over which a vine seems to spread its leafy shade. While it reminds us of Woolf's Room of One's Own, this extremely appealing and aspirational fantasy is not only about privacy and independence, but also perfect order and placement, having just enough things to be attractive and entertaining, but not enough to clutter or overwhelm. The opposite of this perfect retreat, with the airiness and space and closest to nature that comes with it, is London and its cramped, fragmented little passages. Indeed, the main organizing distinction in a typical year for these women was the movement between town and country, usually divided into the winter and the summer. The two lifestyles had very different rhythms and practically existed in different time zones, with town hours and country hours for rising, meals, socializing, and going to bed. Talbot's friend Jemima Gray referred to fashionable London life as a whirligig, an endless round of visits, plays, concerts, assemblies, and balls. It was somehow both idle and excessively busy. Talbot and Jemima would complain that even though this was the chance for all of their friends to be in town together, one's time was so broken by formal engagements that one never got to enjoy their company properly. A huge town like this, Talbot concluded, is almost as much removed from comfortable, cheerful, and rational society as a solitude. She once jotted down notes of a single week that seemed to be full of nothing but noise, anxiety, and turning down yet more social events, until she was quite sick of everything and everybody and wanted to go into a nunnery. The countryside, however, was a pastoral paradise by comparison. While visiting Jemima Gray's home at Rest Park in Bedfordshire, where nothing interesting happens, Talbot wrote, "Once in my life, dear Miss Carter, you shall hear me acknowledge that I have leisure in abundance. I am here in an enchanted castle with no one earthly thing to do, no one interruption of business, real or pretended, not so much as a call for the toilette of more than 5 minutes, an absolute, unquestioned liberty. The most delightful groves to wander in all day, and a library that will carry one as far as ever one chooses to travel in an evening. Because time in the country was so much more less structured, of course, this could give people vastly inflated ideas about how much they could actually accomplish. With no one earthly thing to do, one could potentially do everything." Jemima Gray gave voice to the sentiment, which we will all find extremely familiar in lockdown, when she was stuck at home with her younger daughter after inoculation for the smallpox. "It seemed to myself that 10 days without any engagements must afford one a vast deal of leisure time, and that I must, in my own defense, read through folios, But to my great surprise, I find I do no more in the day than if my scheme was spending most part of it abroad. She lists her distractions as the necessary business of running the household, messages, visitors, tending to the toddler, and reading to her older daughter and answering her questions. All this runs through the hours as completely as any more glamorous occupations. Indeed, Catherine Talbot wrote, I cannot imagine how one contrives to have so little time in the country, but it really is fact. Amabel Gray, who is the older girl in that painting, would become another teenager that Talbot would mentor. Her letters show the process of her elite education. As her mother once told her, more helps than earlier have been afforded you to improve in every branch of virtue and acquire every accomplishment than is usual at your time of life, and more therefore must you see be expected from you than others. Yet for all of Amabel's curiosity and encouragement towards various intellectual pursuits, the Gray household was rather more relaxed about timekeeping. Writing from Brest, Jemima told Catherine Talbot about their long, late breakfasts together in the garden and the bad habits that they had all fallen into. If I could persuade myself to keep earlier hours at night, I would meet you at 6 o'clock every morning most willingly. Nay, I choose and intend it now, if I could bring it to bear, which I confess I do not, and have even designed to see the sunrise and threatened to call up my girls for that purpose. But they daily outsleep the sun unmolested by me, and what is out of one's usual course grows, I find, to be a difficulty. Writing to Talbot towards the end of that same lazy summer, a 16-year-old Amabel would hear the voice of conscience asking her, Pray, friend Belle, what have you been doing all this summer alone with Mamma at rest? While really a great many things that I designed to do, take views in trees by the dozens, draw and paint flowers by sheetfuls, read various histories, study the globes of astronomy, try experiments with the prism, write spectators, etc., etc., etc. But the prisms have remained untouched. The globes begun upon, deferred at weeks' intervals, and very little understood. And that has been the case with most other things we undertook. These exchanges with Amabel were clearly what inspired Talbot's second published dialogue, in which she asks a young lady of 18, What have you done this summer? And she responds, Rode and laughed and fretted. While she had planned to improve her memory and restrain her fancy, to lay out her time to the best advantage, she only gets through the easiest part of her reading list, and her study of arithmetic extends only as far as buying one of the best books of the subject. Likely following Talbot's example, from the ages of 18 to 76, Amabel Gray would keep 37 volumes of daily journals, in which she recorded world events, her social engagements, and political opinions. It's not a very introspective diary, but most years, on her birthday, the 2nd of February, she would stop for some serious reflections and taking stock of her life, often worrying, almost in a reflexive fashion, that she is not making the best possible use of it. Did she spend her time well? As her current biographer, this is the question that I have to grapple with. Her CV includes 5 anonymously published books, some that I've only recently found out about, a variety of manuscript works in prose, poetry, and drama, drawings and etchings, estate management, art collecting, a 9-volume manuscript edition of her mother's correspondence, and of course, her many, many letters and diaries. As with the better known Bluestockings, her work combines a focus on documentary preservation and public duty with an insistence on anonymity and privacy, which has made it easy for these figures to disappear from the literary canon. There's also the fact that the fragmentation and interruption of these women's writings can make them hard to assimilate into a modern arc of a literary career. Many of them, from Elizabeth Elstob to Clara Reeve, mention having drawers and notebooks full of unfinished projects. And their reasons for stopping can be extremely varied, ranging from marriage and motherhood to financial insecurity to simply moving on to something else. Here, for instance, are just some of the schemes for tragedies jotted down at the ends of some of Amabel's diaries, a mix of character lists, plot considerations, and scraps of verse that she was working through. But even by attending more to such manuscripts and works in progress, as I try to do, I am aware that I'm still focusing on the idea of textual productivity and output, which constituted only one part of these women's intellectual lives. Even the recent movement for slow scholarship, after all, still implies that we are going somewhere, and that slowing down may actually enable us to reach it better. In her excellent recent book, Reading and the Making of Time in the 18th Century, Christina Lupton has discussed the struggle to find time for reading amidst the clock watching and social busyness of this period. By focusing specifically on reading, including rereading, Lupton describes an activity that remains difficult to fit into models of productivity. Measured in terms of her other outward accomplishments, Lupton writes, Elizabeth Carter's reading bears little obvious fruit. It takes time, but is its own end. Lupton's work is particularly useful and particularly rooted in contemporary feminist concerns because it emphasizes not success and outputs, but happiness and time well spent. Defined not as mastery or progress, but as visibly constructive without being obviously progressive. And for me, this also provides one way out of perhaps the bleakest description of academic labor that I have ever encountered. Samuel Johnson's vision of footnotes following footnotes and refutations following refutations in an endless cycle of motion without progress. This is, of course, something of a utopian ideal, still dependent on privileges of financial security and respite from external demands. And as I have discussed, as many of us will have discovered over the past year, merely having the time for undirected reading is not always the same as doing it. Whatever our circumstances, there is probably no world in which all of us can completely fulfill our intellectual potential. At the time when I was writing this paper, everyone at my own institution received an email from the Vice Chancellor telling us that, given the pandemic, your best is good enough. A play on the unofficial motto of Oxford, where your best isn't good enough. Many of my colleagues reacted, of course, by pointing out that they weren't currently operating at anything approaching their best, defining that not by the effort expended, but by a state of near perfect optimization. The contention that I want to leave you with, however, is that 18th century Bluestockings, from the ideal Clarissa to the unremembered Amabel, were doing their best, even if they were not always working at their best. And here is Elizabeth Carter summing that up. Sometimes, indeed, I have the grace to be ashamed and really think I'm living to no kind of purpose. At one time, I think it must proceed from a voluntary dilatoriness that I do so little. At another, the whole fault is thrown upon some natural defect, some unavoidable slowness of constitution. At last, tired with all of these various conjectures and speculations, and not pleased nor perfectly satisfied with any of them, I make the shirts I have to make, hear the lessons I have to hear, and upon the whole, go on in the same daily track, tolerably well contented. It is only by accepting the imperfect career paths and work habits of the women we study, perhaps, that we may also be enabled to forgive and even be tolerably well contented with our own. Thank you very much.